In the early 1980s, the Star Trek franchise had been saved by the second big-screen installment, The Wrath of Khan. Its sequel, The Search for Spock, helmed by director Leonard Nimoy, continued the trend of success, and so a fourth big-screen outing was inevitable. Now, without Paramount looking over their shoulders, the creative duo of Leonard Nimoy and producer Harve Bennett were free to do something quite different. Before the release of The Search for Spock, Paramount was already very pleased with Nimoy's work as director, and so asked him to return for the following film. While he was under certain creative constraints for The Search for Spock, for Star Trek IV, they gave the director much greater creative freedom. Nimoy and Bennett both agreed their goal shouldn't be to repeat what had been done before with The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock. Rather than a drama-heavy space opera, they wanted to do a movie which was lighter in tone and without a primary villain for the story. Their initial concept was very different than what became The Voyage Home, due to William Shatner not wanting to reprise his role of Captain Kirk. He and his agent had entered into a salary dispute with Paramount during negotiations for the next installment, and by the time Nimoy and Bennett started conceiving of the next movie, this dispute didn't show any signs of resolution. Thus, Nimoy and Bennett's first idea was for a prequel movie following Kirk and Spock during their time at Starfleet Academy. However, when news of this concept reached fans, the reaction was extremely negative. Eventually, Shatner was able to reach a compromise with Paramount, signing on after a pay rise. Back during the run of the original series, Shatner's representation had drafted a favoured nations clause into his contract. This meant that any pay rise or perks received by Leonard Nimoy would also be received by Shatner and vice versa. Therefore, the increase in salary also translated to Nimoy. This salary dispute between cast and studio, as well as the rising costs of the feature film series in general, is what partly led to Paramount developing Star Trek The Next Generation, which debuted the year after Star Trek IV. Nimoy and Bennett's new concept was a time travel story, in which a problem arises which can only be fixed by retrieving something from the past. Various ideas were discussed, such as travelling back in time to retrieve the cure to a deadly plague. However, this was deemed too gruesome for the light-hearted tone they wanted. It was Nimoy who suggested the idea of retrieving humpback whales after he had read a book on extinct and endangered species. Nimoy was a passionate environmentalist, and the topic of whaling was a hot-button issue at the time. Thus, they created the idea of an alien probe arriving at Earth, sending signals which devastate advanced technology and disrupt the environment. These signals are eventually discovered to be intended for humpback whales, all of which are extinct by the 23rd century. Therefore, it's up to Captain Kirk and his crew to travel back in time and bring some humpback whales back into the 23rd century to make contact with the probe. During the writing process, Paramount was approached by Eddie Murphy, an enormous Star Trek fan, who asked for a role in the film. Fresh off the success of Beverly Hills Cop, Murphy was a big name at the time, and Paramount saw potential in attracting non-Star Trek fans to the fourth film by casting Murphy. Jeffrey Katzenberg described the idea as either the very best or worst idea in the world. The first draft of the script was written by Daniel Petrie Jr., who had penned Beverly Hills Cop. However, his draft wasn't well received and Paramount sought a new writer. Murphy also didn't like the character he was being offered and so decided to take the lead role in The Golden Child instead. The character offered to Murphy was then rewritten and turned into marine biologist Gillian Taylor, for whom Catherine Hicks was cast. Head of production Dawn Steele approached Nicholas Meyer, the writer and director of The Wrath of Khan, and requested he rewrite the current script. Although Meyer was repulsed by the idea of resurrecting Spock for the third film and refused to be involved in that project, by the time Star Trek IV entered development, he had cooled somewhat on the decision and agreed to write a new script for Star Trek IV. Meyer's debut feature Time After Time, which I highlighted in part 3 of this video series, similarly depicted characters out of time having to explore modern-day San Francisco. Meyer chose to have the Enterprise crew visit this same city when they returned to the past. Meyer, Bennett, and Nimoy all worked well together in crafting this new version, successfully injecting the sense of humour Nimoy was keen on. This resulted in scenes such as Spock using the Vulcan nerve pinch to knock out an obnoxious punk rocker playing his music too loud. This was inspired by a real anecdote in which Nimoy encountered a similar figure while queuing at a supermarket. He remembered thinking to himself, "If I could really do the Vulcan nerve pinch, I'd pinch his brains out." The writing process was a collaborative effort between Meyer and Bennett, who divided the task into separate portions. Bennett would write the first and third portions, which took place in the 23rd century, whereas Meyer would write the middle portion taking place in the modern day. After 12 days of writing, they would combine their portions and then do another draft to blend all three sections together smoothly. Nimoy said of Meyer's contribution to the script, "He gave the script the kind of humour and social comment, gadfly attitude I very much wanted. My vision was for no dying, no fighting, no shooting, no photon torpedoes, no phaser blasts, no stereotypical bad guy. I wanted people to really have a great time watching this film, and if somehow in the mix we lobbed a couple of big ideas at them, well, then that would be even better." After another round of rewrites and notes from William Shatner, the script was shown to Paramount executives, who were very pleased. For the production design, not much new was needed. Once again, thanks to Harve Bennett's cost-saving measures, many sets, props, and costumes were reused from previous films. However, the interior of the Klingon bird of prey was redesigned from the second-hand sets seen in The Search for Spock. Starships such as the USS Saratoga were redresses of the USS Reliant model, and the Earth Space Dock model was brought out of storage and retouched for new shots. The new design for the film was that of the alien probe created by the team at ILM. Concept artist Ralph McQuarrie aided in its design, with the team eventually settling on a simple cylinder with a small antenna jutting out from the bottom. 3 models were built at various different scales, the largest being 20 foot long. Originally, the probe was covered in barnacles and painted ocean blue, but when looking back at the first few shots, the ILM team decided the probe didn't seem menacing enough, so they repainted the models black and reshot the sequences. Something else of note are some new graphical designs created for the movie by Michael Okuda, who would later create the LCARS menu system for Star Trek The Next Generation, among other contributions. In contrast to The Search for Spock, which only had a single day of location shooting, the Voyage Home had extensive location shooting around San Francisco and Los Angeles, among other places. For the fictional Cetacean Institute, which houses the 2 whales, Monterey Bay Aquarium in California was used, with the San Francisco skyline and larger water tank added in post. For the scenes taking place aboard the real-life nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, the crew used the non-nuclear-powered USS Ranger. This was because civilians are strictly forbidden from gaining access to any nuclear-powered US Navy vessels. Scenes set on Vulcan were shot at the Vasquez Rocks, which were extensively used in the original series and are a staple of Star Trek locations, most recently appearing in Star Trek Picard, where they played themselves for the first time. Other shots around the Klingon bird of prey were shot at Paramount's backlot. The nature of the film's plot also required a large body of water, something which the production team found surprisingly hard to come by.
Years ago in Hollywood, most of the major studios had what they called a tank, a very large, oversized swimming pool is what it was, which they could do surface work and underwater photography work. And the tanks had either been closed up because they were no longer being used, or the ones that were still available were inadequate to our purposes for one reason or another. So we were kind of stymied for a while, until one day we were walking around out here in what is now a parking lot here at Paramount, and standing in front of this large blue screen, which was used as a background for some exterior scenes, and our special effects people noticed some seams in the ground around here and went back to the original plans for the building of this studio and discovered that the ground that I'm standing on is actually filled in and was a water tank about 15 feet deep years ago. And they used to use it for surface water battles and water scenes and underwater scenes and that sort of thing. And we discovered that we could do an excavation right here on the Paramount lot. And what grew out of that was a show, the kind of which Hollywood hasn't seen in a long time.
A thread originally deleted from the film before shooting, but retained in the novelization, is the reason for Saavik remaining on Vulcan. In the previous film, it is implied Saavik mates with the rapidly aging Spock during his Pon farr. By the time of Star Trek IV, Saavik was originally said to be pregnant with Spock's child. However, this was deleted from the script before ever being shot. Although a lot of the production was location filming, some large sets were still built for the film in some important settings. First was the Federation Council chamber, first seen in this movie. As a cost-saving measure, production manager Jack T. Collis built the set with only one end. For the reverse angle, the podiums and various delegates simply switched sides rather than spending the time to do a new camera setup. This is a cost and time-saving measure more common than you may think, called cheating the turnaround. Another important set was that of Starfleet Command. To research for this location, Nimoy and Bennett visited the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory for inspiration. A notable piece of this set is a central table with some screens and monitors on it, which was nicknamed the pool table. This piece was later used as the control desk in engineering for Star Trek The Next Generation. For the visual effects, ILM had a much lighter workload when it came to outer space sequences. Many starship shots involving the Bird of Prey, USS Saratoga, and Earth Space Dock relied on motion-controlled camera shots, various elements being shot with a camera programmed to follow a specific path and then composited together.
The shot where the Bird of Prey comes in under the Golden Gate Bridge, and they had built a large forced perspective miniature of the bridge, and they basically had it out in the parking lot behind what we called UJ building.
We had it in our back lot, a little miniature of the bridge, and we were piling in a bunch of fog and smoke, and we had basically a miniature lake that we'd created. And what they were trying to do was have the Bird of Prey come flying underneath the bridge.
And for the longest time, they were attempting to get the Bird of Prey as a practical. They were trying to put the model on a wire rig and fly it through there and get the shot. And it just was complicated for a variety of reasons.
The timings and the look, especially with the smoke coming through and everything, was just a very tough shot.
So in the end, ultimately that shot was a composite where the Bird of Prey was shot as a motion control element.
And it's really difficult to take a miniature and fly it through a scene and shoot it live action wise. So we decided just to use the bridge aspect. The background looked beautiful, and then I ended up in motion control doing the Bird of Prey, just sneaking under that bridge and flying by camera. And it's another one of the shots that I'm very proud of, and I felt like, boy, this will be kind of a signature shot, and I think it was.
An ambitious scene in the film was the dreamlike sequence experienced by Kirk and the crew when they begin time traveling. This involved painting the entire Klingon bridge set white for the start of the sequence, but the most difficult portions were those created using computer graphics. A 3D scanning technology developed by a company called Cyberware was used to scan the heads of the actors. These 3D scans were then animated and morphed into one another for the final shot. These 30 seconds in the film took 2 weeks to fully render. The most challenging aspect of the film's visual effects was creating the whales themselves. There was very little in the way of usable stock footage available for the film, so ILM was tasked with devising a way to create whales for the film. After some trial and error, they created a total of 4 radio-controlled model whales roughly 4 foot long. They traveled to Serra High School in San Mateo, California, and used their swimming pool to shoot the sequences with the model whales. A large team of technicians and operators completed the shots in 2 weeks. In addition to this, the team built large, full-scale animatronics for certain scenes, such as a tail, upper fin, and eye. When the film eventually debuted, Paramount came under immense scrutiny from animal rights groups. The effects were so convincing, these groups assumed the production team had used real whales and were concerned how close the cast and crew had gotten to them while shooting. Nimoy and Paramount executives remedied the situation by inviting representatives of these groups to their facilities to show them how the whales were brought to life. For the film's score, composer James Horner wasn't available to return, so Nimoy hired Leonard Rosenman, who had composed the score for Nicholas Meyer's first film Time After Time, among other films such as The Fantastic Voyage and the animated Lord of the Rings movie. He originally wanted to do a reorchestration of Alexander Courage's theme from the original series, but Nimoy requested an original piece instead. Elsewhere in the score though, he did bring back the original theme for the reappearance of the Enterprise. He took heavy inspiration from Russian classical composers to inject a bright playfulness to the action, particularly Chekhov's escape from the USS Enterprise. For more contemporary music, Rosenman collaborated with the jazz fusion group the Yellow Jackets for cues in San Francisco and other cues around the whales. The result is a score quite different from the previous Trek films, and remains something of an oddity within the musical history of the franchise. Once again, thanks to the cost-efficient running of the production and Nimoy's strong direction, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home was completed on time on a budget of $21 million. It was released on the 26th of November, 1986. Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home is a movie I have truly mixed feelings about as a fan of Star Trek. It's undeniably a fun romp and exactly the light-hearted, enjoyable caper Nimoy wanted it to be, but it's never been one of my go-to Star Trek movies. Nimoy's classical and economical direction carries over to this movie with an emphasis away from flashy camera moves or striking compositions, and instead on robust pacing, character, and performance. Due to the contemporary setting, it doesn't look as spectacular as The Search for Spock, but the extensive location shooting lends the film a realism and gravity to the events. Rather than the stagey, operatic tone of Star Trek III, this one feels much more down to earth. Although that's not to say there aren't some terrific visual effects sequences throughout the film. Once again, ILM's work is truly exceptional. The mysterious probe is extremely memorable as an antagonistic force. Not evil, of course, but the sound design, visuals, and sheer scale of this thing make it really menacing. And with each Star Trek movie, the spaceship and space station shots just seem to get better and better. The really impressive achievement, however, are the whales themselves. They look completely real. While there is some stock footage of real whales here and there, it's estimated about 90% of the shots use either the radio-controlled whale models or the full-scale animatronics, and as a viewer you simply cannot tell. It's hardly surprising that various animal rights groups were up in arms, because even now I don't question for a second if these things are real. It's easily some of the best practical effects work done in movie history, and it's likely because they're so convincing they actually don't often come up on those great practical effects lists you sometimes see on the internet. Leonard Rosenman's score for the film truly does feel like the odd one out when it comes to Star Trek music. It's a totally different flavour to the sweeping symphonies of Jerry Goldsmith and the swashbuckling style of James Horner. That being said though, it's still a really good score in its own right. The new main theme is really memorable, the action cues throughout are so playful and enjoyable to listen to, but Rosenman still manages to inject plenty of drama into the film when he needs to, and I really like the brief rendition of the original series theme at the end. It's short, but it's very nice. The humour for the film is delightful, with so many quotable lines which have become memes in Star Trek fandom today. I also appreciate how much more the supporting cast actually have to do in this movie. Traditionally, the emphasis is placed on Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, with Chekhov, Uhura, Sulu, and Scotty mostly being relegated to technobabble or ship function dialogue. But here, by splitting the crew off into different plot threads, many of those great lines and fun scenes are led by these characters, and it's really welcome. Catherine Hicks is also great in the film. While many of the most famous quotes come from the established cast, the dialogue for Gillian Taylor is super charming, and Hicks gives a very endearing performance. My main issue with The Voyage Home is that it's simply not the kind of Star Trek I prefer. This is where the creative intentions of the filmmakers clash with my own personal taste. I much prefer the outer space adventure and space opera sides of the Star Trek franchise, and often find myself instinctively favouring the motion picture The Wrath of Khan or The Search for Spock over this one. That's not to say I dislike The Voyage Home, not at all. It's a delightfully enjoyable movie, but perhaps the premise of a Star Trek crew travelling back to the modern day has been done a little too often for it to be really something special anymore. I know this movie is often ranked quite highly by a lot of Trekkies, and I totally see why. Every time I rewatch it, I have a blast. But for me, it's not one I place near the top of my list. It's kind of a funny conclusion to present as a review, I know. After all, the film achieves everything it sets out to do, and in terrific fashion. But it's not a movie which has had a particularly strong impact on me as a Star Trek fan. It may not be what I prefer when it comes to Star Trek, but I'm always happy to watch it, and I'm happy it's loved by so many others. Upon release, Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home was met with box office success and critical praise. It more than doubled the opening week of The Search for Spock, and went on to gross $133 million worldwide, coming close to matching the gross of the motion picture. However, thanks to The Voyage Home's lower budget and strong home video sales, Star Trek IV became the most profitable film in the franchise at that point. The film attracted many general filmgoers as well as long-time Star Trek fans. Critics praised its refreshing change of direction and lighthearted tone. Particular praise was given to the sense of humour and the performances from the cast. The film frequently appears near the top of many Trekkies' personal rankings and is regarded as one of the strongest entries in the film series to this day. Of the two Star Trek movies he directed, Nimoy named The Voyage Home as his personal favourite. And it seemed fitting to end on such a high, so to speak. By end, I refer to the often named Star Trek trilogy of The Wrath of Khan, The Search for Spock, and The Voyage Home. With the crew restored to the Enterprise, and all the lingering plot threads wrapped up in this installment, This was effectively the completion of a multi-part arc. Producer Harve Bennett, having worked tirelessly on the movies for 7 years by this point, considered stepping away from the franchise to work on new things. However, back when production of Star Trek IV was commencing, William Shatner expressed an interest in directing a Star Trek movie himself. Due to the aforementioned favoured nations clause in his contract, Shatner was technically owed a chance at directing thanks to Nimoy being given the big chair. Soon after the Voyage Home wrapped, Shatner began getting ready to helm the next Star Trek movie. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.